What happens when the one who has silently carried the pain of others finally dares to face the darkness within themselves? If you've ever felt like you're too sensitive in a world that moves too fast and feels too loud, this might be the moment you finally hear something you've always known, but no one ever had the words to say. Empaths are no longer just the healers. In truth, they never were. That was simply a beautiful story we, well-meaning as we were, told ourselves to make sense of their deep and often aching presence in this world. But according to Carl Jung's perspective, the true role of the empath is far greater and far more unsettling. They are not here to soothe surface wounds. They are here to illuminate the shadow, the parts of our collective psyche that have been repressed for generations. Their presence, what so many once labeled as overly sensitive, is not a flaw to be fixed. It is a living symbol, a silent reminder that something in us, in all of us, in this entire culture, remains unacknowledged. And like all things left in the dark, it doesn't stay quiet, it leaks, it distorts, it erupts, as sudden rage, unexplained depression, or the silent fracture between generations. Empaths, as Jung alluded to in the archetype of the oracle, are not just feelers, they are mirrors, and what they reflect back, many of us are not yet ready to see. So many empaths, especially those in the second half of life, have spent decades quietly believing, something must be wrong with me. They've felt too much, cried for no clear reason, carried the emotional burdens of others without understanding why. Many grew up in emotionally disconnected families, where sensitivity was met with silence or shame, and vulnerability was mistaken for weakness. But this is not personal dysfunction. It is a spiritual design. As Jung said, the collective unconscious knows no boundary. An empath doesn't only feel their own wounds, they absorb what remains unspoken in the family system. The ancestral line, even the soul of a nation. They are the guardians of what hasn't been grieved, the witnesses of what's been suppressed, the voice of what no one dared to say out loud. I once worked with a woman, a mother, a wife, a daughter, who had never felt normal in her life. She wept often, without reason, felt unsafe in crowds. In dreams, she wandered through abandoned cities, heard the cries of lost children, felt the weight of unnamed sorrow. For years, she thought she was simply depressed. But when we stopped trying to diagnose and started listening, symbols began to speak. She was carrying the unwept grief of the women in her lineage. Those who had endured war, displacement, silence, but were never given a space to feel. Empaths are not here to fix the world in the conventional sense. They are here to feel what the world refuses to feel. And when they learn to stay with the pain without becoming it, they become alchemists of the shadow. They do not repair. They do not rescue. They simply witness. And sometimes, when the witnessing is deep, honest, and without agenda, that alone becomes the most powerful healing of all. Jung called this work shadow integration, not the kind of work that earns applause. People don't thank you when you reflect back their fear, shame, or buried grief, but it is the gateway to awakening. In a world obsessed with positivity and light, Someone must be willing to say, "No, there is suffering here. There is a forgotten soul still waiting to be seen." The awakened empath no longer seeks approval. They no longer dissolve into the pain of others to feel worthy. They no longer need to heal to feel enough, because they have come to understand that their value lies in their very capacity to feel, to witness, and to remain present with the truth, even when that truth is inconvenient, uncomfortable, or quietly terrifying. And when that happens, the empath is no longer a victim of emotion. They become a guide for the soul. Not loud, not labeled, simply present. Present with such clarity, with such integrity, that the whole room falls into stillness. That is not healing. That is awakening. They don't just feel their own emotions. Empaths become vessels for pain that stretches beyond their lifetime, across generations. Their souls carry inherited memory. The cries that were never heard. The dreams that were never lived. This is not a metaphor. It is a reality that depth psychology, especially through the work of Carl Jung, recognized long ago. We are not isolated individuals. We are streams within a larger current. And empaths, due to their uniquely sensitive spiritual constitution, are often the deepest rivers, the ones in which ancestral memory still whispers, still flows, still seeks a way to be seen. They may find themselves weeping over a song they've never heard before, choking up in a place they've never visited, or waking in the middle of the night with a grief that has no name. These emotions are not always their own. Sometimes, they belong to others who lived, who suffered, but who were never given permission to express it. A mother who couldn't cry during the war. A father whose fear was never acknowledged. A grandmother who buried her sorrow over a lost child, yet still rose each day to cook for the family. The empath absorbs it all, and they carry these feelings as if they were their own. I've met so many people, souls who have spent their entire lives listening to others, yet rarely had anyone truly listen to them. They often carry a sense of heaviness, even though their current life appears fine on the surface. They tell me they cry alone, that they feel drained simply by being around others, as though they're carrying some invisible weight. One woman once said to me, "I feel like I'm living someone else's life, and I can't stop." And she was. She was carrying the emotional ghost of her mother. A woman who spent her life enduring, unloved in the way she needed, never granted the space to dream. Now, that mother's unspoken longing for freedom ran like an electric current through her daughter. No one told her to feel it, but it came anyway, and it demanded to be lived. This is the most difficult part of an empath's journey. Because society teaches us logic. It teaches us that if there's no reason for a feeling, the feeling must be wrong. But Jung reminded us, the unconscious is not rational. It simply seeks expression. The empath becomes the portal through which that long-silenced expression finally emerges. And if the empath isn't guided to understand, this isn't all mine, they can collapse beneath the weight of it. They may move through life believing they're too sensitive, too fragile, or worse, that something is wrong with them. They feel guilty for feeling too much, not realizing that they are, in fact, offering silent service to a lineage of souls who never had the chance to name their grief. Carl Jung called this the embodiment of the collective shadow. When one individual, if sensitive enough, begins to carry what the community could not bear, it's not a metaphor, it is a psychic and spiritual reality. And if that person can survive the early confusion, the disorientation, they may become a light bearer. Not by invention, not by saving others, but by simply naming what has always been there in the dark. This path is not for the faint of heart. It demands that the empath relinquish the idea of, "I am the center," and accept that some of what moves through them is coming from beyond. But it's in that moment that a deeper process begins. What Jung called individuation, the sacred journey of becoming fully oneself. This is not a pleasant process. It requires stepping out of the roles of the good one, the helper, the peacekeeper, and stepping into a fuller, more integrated self, one that holds both light and shadow, both compassion and boundaries. When the empath begins to ask, "Is this pain truly mine?" they take their first real step toward inner maturity. They stop merging with every strange emotion that passes through them. Instead, they begin to listen, to discern. They become interpreters of the soul, a rare kind of human in an era that talks endlessly, but listens so little. And that capacity for deep silence, to truly hear what has never been named, is the strange and sacred gift of the empath. Not to fix, but to be present. Not to explain, but to bear witness. And sometimes, that kind of loving witness is the very first step toward bringing the shadow back into the light. And that, perhaps above all else, the ability to hold deep silence and listen for the voices that have never been named, is the strange and sacred gift of the empath. Not to fix, not to explain, but to be present. Their sensitivity, like an ancient compass buried deep in the soul, has long been misunderstood. The world has labeled it as weakness, fragility, overreactivity, but through the eyes of Carl Jung, this sensitivity is not a flaw. It is a spiritual architecture, an evolutionary design of the psyche, created to access depths most have long forgotten, the realm of the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious, as Jung described, is not a place of illusion. It is the field of archetypes, where symbols, myths, unresolved trauma, and the most authentic unlived aspects of the soul reside. It is the landscape of wordless memory, of images returning in dreams, of emotions that cannot be named but feel as real as waking life. The empath connects with that depth effortlessly. They do not need to study it. They feel it, and that is enough. Like a radio tuned to the right frequency, they pick up what others miss. They perceive unspoken energies, the invisible language beneath words. And yes, at times, it overwhelms them. It exhausts them. It makes them question their sanity. Because no one ever told them that what they're feeling isn't too much. It's too real. Some cry without knowing why. Some tremble when they walk into a room. Others find themselves overtaken by the emotions of another, as if no boundary exists. But they are not broken. They are translating, delivering messages from a deeper layer of the human soul, a place far beyond the reach of logic. And because these messages lack language, they flood the body as pure emotion. If not understood, the empath may live a lifetime believing they are emotionally flawed. But when they begin to understand that this sensitivity is not something to fix, but a tool to interpret the messages of the collective psyche, everything begins to shift. They stop resisting themselves. They start listening. They observe their emotions like a gardener watches the seasons. Not to control them, but to understand. Not to suppress, but to accompany. Through that lens, sensitivity ceases to be a burden. It becomes wisdom, a wisdom not written in books, but imprinted in the cells, in the soul. And with that wisdom, they begin to read the language of symbols. A dream is no longer just a dream. A repeated image is no longer dismissed as meaningless. A sudden discomfort in the middle of the day is no longer diagnosed as disorder. Everything starts to speak. Jung once said, "He who looks outside dreams, but he who looks inside awakens." To ignore the language of the dream is to cut off the dialogue of the soul. The empath, by the very design of their psyche, is one of those chosen to keep that dialogue alive. But like every keeper of fire in the darkness, they must learn to stand steady within the flame. They must learn to know what is theirs, and what is an echo. Without that, they drown. Sensitivity, when misunderstood, becomes a storm, but when honored, it becomes a beacon. And so, someone who once felt lost, who once believed they were strange or broken in a cold world, begins to realize they were never wrong. They were born to see what others were not ready to face. Not to speak louder, not to fix everything, but simply to be present. And in doing so, dissolve a layer of the collective fog, where the human soul has slept too long. Sensitivity is the bridge between the visible world and the one not yet born. It is the crack where light gets in. And the empath, whether or not they've ever known the name for what they are, has always been the one holding that door open. Sensitivity is a bridge between the world we see and the world yet to be born. It is the tiny crack through which light enters. And the empath, even without knowing the name for what they are, has always been the one holding that door open. But light, if not held with wisdom, can burn. The unawakened empath is often drowned in the very currents they were born to feel. They absorb pain without knowing where to place it. They weep for others, but cannot tell who is actually crying inside them. Their inner world and the outer one blur into a vast, endless sea, without shore, without anchor. And in that sea, they begin to lose themselves. Emotional fusion, the state of merging with another's pain, can look, at first, like compassion, like unconditional love, but without inner boundaries, it becomes a quiet erasure of the self. Jung once warned, a relationship without proper differentiation leads to the collapse of the ego. And this is what happens to so many empaths. They mistake love for complete absorption, for disappearing into someone else's suffering. But in time, through silent heartbreaks and invisible breakdowns, the mature empath begins to understand something essential. To witness is not the same as to merge. To care is not the same as to carry. This marks the beginning of their inner freedom. When they finally see the line between, I see your pain, and I am your pain. Compassion transforms into something healing. Not a blind merging, not emotional martyrdom, but clear, grounded, human presence. I once worked with a woman everyone called the angel in the room. She was always there when someone needed help. Always listening, always giving, always holding space, until her body started to give out. She couldn't sleep. She felt exhausted every day. Eventually, she fell into a deep depression. In a quiet, vulnerable moment, she wept and said, I've lived 60 years believing I'm not allowed to let anyone be sad around me. And when we gently peeled back the layers, what emerged wasn't selflessness, but fear. The fear of being abandoned if she didn't make everyone else feel okay. She wasn't giving out of pure love. She was giving to avoid being forgotten. This is where false compassion hides. Not in cruelty, but in compulsion. It gives not from fullness, but from a silent contract. If I heal you, maybe I'll be worthy of staying. Left unexamined, this becomes a kind of sacred self-destruction. But the awakened empath slowly learns to return home to themselves. They begin to see clearly what belongs to others, and what is a reflection of their own unmet needs. They are no longer swept into every emotional wave that crashes by. They learn to stand at the shore, to listen, without dissolving. They observe quietly, feel deeply, and choose when to step forward, and when to remain still. This witnessing holds an invisible power. In today's world, where everyone is trying to fix everyone else, a person who can simply stand still, without judgment, without intrusion, simply present, becomes a rare and powerful healer. That silent space, where another is fully seen, not analyzed, not interrupted, that is where true transformation begins. Jung called this love without possession. A love where the other is free to fully exist, without needing to be shaped, rescued, or remade. And that is when the empath is no longer an emotional sponge, but a steady mirror, where others may see themselves clearly, without being absorbed or lost in reflection. They no longer need to prove their worth by overgiving. They no longer confuse sacrifice with connection. They simply become who they are. Whole, deep, and unapologetic. And strangely, it is this non-interference, this stillness, that liberates others the most. They no longer need to do something to prove their worth. No longer feel the need to be the one who endures the most. The one who is always there when others need them. Or the one who silently carries burdens no one asked them to hold. They stop seeking validation through self-sacrifice, no longer trading their own well-being for someone else's comfort. Because presence, whole, clear, undefended, is enough. In a world that constantly pushes people to act, to help, to prove their usefulness, the mature empath comes to understand a deeper truth. Their value does not come from how much they do, how much they can endure, or how much emotion they can absorb for others. It comes from their ability to remain with themselves, to listen without dissolving, to witness without merging, to show up without performing. They no longer rush in to rescue. They no longer swallow the emotional storms of those around them. They no longer serve as the bridge that holds everything together at their own expense. They simply remain still, grounded, and deeply human, like a quiet pillar in the middle of someone else's emotional storm. And it is that very presence, free of any attempt to fix, soothe, or withdraw, that begins to invite others back to themselves. This is when the empath learns something essential. You do not have to become someone else to be seen. You do not have to dissolve in order to be accepted. You do not have to disappear for others to feel safe. You just have to be yourself. Clear, boundaried, and still open. And sometimes, it is this very not doing, this complete and grounded presence, that helps another feel truly safe. For the very first time, the empath becomes the Firebearer, the holder of symbols, the silent alchemist, transmuting pain into insight, wounds into wisdom, emotion into awakening, and then, once they've learned to stand within themselves, no longer merging with others' feelings, no longer avoiding the darker aspects of life, something else arrives, a truth greater and lonelier. They are the mirror of the collective, not a polished mirror, not a flattering one, but a raw, ancient kind of reflection, bronze, tarnished, unfiltered, the kind that reveals what no one wants to see. Cracks, unspoken lies, emotions that have been pushed into the farthest corners of cultural denial. They don't reflect who we wish we were. They reflect who we've avoided becoming. They carry voices never given breath, questions that society isn't ready to answer, emotions too wild, too inconvenient, too untamed for the modern mold. And because of this, they are often exiled, not because they are wrong, but because they speak the truth. Too soon, too deeply, too clearly, before anyone else is ready to listen. Like the oracles of ancient myth, those who stood between the worlds of spirit and society. The empath holds two things the modern world fears most: intuition and truth. The cost of seeing early is to be misunderstood. The cost of feeling too clearly is to be labeled weak. The cost of emotional honesty is to be called too much, too complicated, too different. But on a spiritual level, this isolation is not a punishment. It is a quiet rite of passage, a sacred dismembering from the noise of the crowd, so they can finally hear what must be heard, the voice of what has yet to be born within the collective. Jung once said, "Anyone who carries a living symbol that cannot yet be shared will always feel estranged." But that doesn't mean they are wrong. It simply means they carry a different time. They speak the language of the future, in a room still fast asleep in the past. Perhaps that's why empaths are so often found at the edge. Not because they were left behind, but because they were placed there. To see the whole picture. They don't push to the center. They don't shout. They watch. They feel. They hold the message. And when the time comes, they are the first to name the crack everyone tried to cover with fresh paint. The first to cry over something no one dares to admit is real. The first to speak when the soul of a people begins to fracture. Not to disrupt, but to clarify. A mirror does not break the face. It only reflects what's already there. The empath, when they accept this role, no longer seeks to fit. They stop needing to be understood immediately. They don't shrink themselves to fit into a box never made for them. They know not everyone is ready to hear the truth, but the truth still needs someone to carry it. And so they stay quiet, steady, deep, holding what no one has dared to speak. Because they know, someday, what no one wants to hear will become what must finally be said. And it is the empath, the one once labeled too sensitive, too fragile, too emotional, who now carries the language of a new world. They are the way showers of an emerging psychic architecture. Not through grand declarations, but through the quiet power of their presence. As society slowly awakens from its centuries-long spell of rational supremacy, where emotion was something to manage, and intuition was exiled from the table of truth, the empath steps out from the margins like a living map. A map of feeling, of honesty, of inner realms that have never been given a voice. They do not come armed with theories. They do not speak in the name of science. They come from experience, from decades spent dwelling in the in-between, between knowing and not knowing, between feeling and analysis, between being fully present and yet unnamed. And precisely because they have lived in that space, they carry the quiet ability to guide others just beginning to enter it. Those who are, for the first time, touching a sorrow they can't explain. Those realizing their exhaustion isn't just from overwork, but from under-connection to their own soul. Those beginning to hear a whisper inside, and don't yet know what to call it. The empath does not merely reflect. They hold the rhythm of the age to come. They are the vibrational center. Not because they speak the loudest, but because they feel the deepest. They are the axis around which others are beginning to orbit. As people slowly shed the roles they've worn for too long, and return to the rawness of being, as the world begins to remember that not all truths can be measured, that not every sacred thing fits inside a textbook, and that reason without heart becomes sterile. The empath, shaped by the alchemy of their own sensitivity, becomes a guardian standing at the threshold of two eras. They help us remember, emotion is not the enemy of intelligence. It is what's been missing. It is the silent guide of intuition. It is the compass needle of the soul that we have cast aside for too long in pursuit of logic. But reason without heart creates systems, not life. And now that the systems are cracking, we are being summoned back to where we began, to the place where the soul has been waiting to be seen. The empath does not lead with a pre-made map. They lead by walking first, by falling first, by feeling first. They know how cold the rain can be, how thick the dark becomes, and what happens when you try to rationalize a wound that only wants to be witnessed. And because they've already walked that road, they can sit beside others, not as experts, but as human beings, who have learned how not to look away. That is their role in this time. Not as heroes, not as teachers, but as rhythm keepers, the ones who hold what has not yet been named, so that when others arrive, they do not have to walk alone. They are the first notes of a new symphony, resonating in a culture that has, for too long, lived in the silence of its own disconnection. Awakening does not arrive in a sudden blaze of light. It unfolds quietly, through subtle shifts in perception, through the gradual reorientation of where an empath chooses to stand within their own psyche. At first, they live as a reflex, an extended nervous system absorbing, soothing, and carrying the emotional weight of others. But as they enter the deeper stages of maturity, they begin to step away from that position, not out of exhaustion, but out of clarity, because the role of the rescuer never truly reflected who they are at their core. The awakening journey of an empath involves dismantling a psychic structure built on emotional obligation. As the layers of needing to be liked, needed, or indispensable begin to fall away, what emerges is a new internal posture. The witness with intention, no longer driven by compulsion to intervene, nor fused with every energy they encounter. From this point on, they stop revolving around collective expectations. They no longer seek to control the emotional outcomes of others. An inner principle begins to form. Presence is no longer a tool for appeasement. It becomes the ground where truth may emerge. In its own time, in its own way, and free from the interference of egoic will. Their inner space is no longer an open field where others may imprint and leave traces. It becomes an ordered structure, defined, spacious, and sovereign, capable of witnessing without dissolving, of feeling without being overtaken. What they now seek is not harmony at all costs, but inner coherence, a felt sense of self that is not shaped by temporary roles or fleeting emotional tides. At this point, the empath no longer needs to do anything to be valuable. They are not compelled to express empathy as a moral duty. Instead, their entire presence becomes a form of existential ethics, where their lived truth stands whole and unedited, untouched by the projections of society. This is the threshold where the empath releases the desire to be needed, a longing that, while appearing noble, often masks a deeper defense mechanism rooted in survival. They relinquish the dependency on external validation, and in doing so, they access a deeper form of freedom. Freedom from defining themselves through the pain of others. And in that space, a new quality emerges, not the virtue of sacrifice, but the embodiment of wholeness. Wholeness, not as the sum of all good parts, but as the integration of opposites, vulnerability and boundary, intuition and clarity, compassion and discernment. An empath rooted in this wholeness no longer operates under the moral anxiety of, am I doing enough? Or, am I being responsible enough? They discover a deeper kind of responsibility, one tethered not to outcomes, but to inner truth, inner precision, and the protection of their own sacred psychic structure. And from there, their presence becomes transparent, not a means to achieve something from others, but a living environment in which natural transformation can occur. No intervention, no manipulation, no forcing, just a silence deep enough for the truth to reveal itself. Carl Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to hold two opposing truths at once without breaking. A consciousness that can embrace contradiction without needing to erase, choose sides, or destroy one in order to protect the other. An awakened empath becomes the embodiment of this function, not because they no longer feel pain, but because they no longer need to split themselves off from pain in order to live. They are the bridge between what once seemed irreconcilable, between emotion and reason, between wounding and wisdom, between darkness and light, but they are not the light, and they do not belong to the dark. They are the dawn, that quiet liminal space, where the horizon hasn't yet declared itself as day or night, is the spiritual home of the empath. It is the place where rebirth happens without fanfare, where the self is remade, not by adding more, but by welcoming back all that was once exiled. In this dawn space, the empath no longer seeks someone to save or a role to perform. They become a point of stillness from which the world can begin to sense itself again. No effort. No words, just the clarity of presence, like the first drop of dew on a withered leaf after a long night. And perhaps, in that presence, others will begin to ask themselves, can I live more truthfully? Can I stop running and begin to truly listen to myself? Can I step out of the roles I've worn and enter my own dawn? The empath no longer seeks connection by compromising themselves. In the journey of awakening, there is a subtle but vital turning point. The moment the empath realizes that not all closeness is born of truth, and not every bond is evidence of love. Many of the relationships they have built throughout their lives were forged through self-compromise, shrinking themselves, muting their real emotions, even silencing their intuition, just to maintain harmony on the surface. These are surface-level connections, where the empath absorbs collective emotions, adjusts their natural rhythm to match the other person, and sacrifices inner honesty to keep the peace. But what they eventually come to see is this: harmony built on self-erasure is never true harmony. It is a refined echo of old patterns, where love was conditional, granted only when one didn't disrupt, didn't feel too much, didn't become a burden, after enough experiences of losing themselves out of fear of losing others. The empath begins to ask a different question. Were these relationships truly nurturing, or merely places where they learned to go silent? And that's when a deeper transformation begins. They no longer choose relationships where they have to feel less emotional, less curious, or less real. They begin to step back from spaces where sensitivity is mistaken for weakness, silence is misread as distance, and intuition is dismissed as impractical. Instead of connecting by diminishing themselves, they begin to connect from a place of fullness. They stop searching for people who can fill the emptiness, and start seeking those who can simply stand beside them without leaning, without needing to be leaned on. No one is the center. No one is the hero. Only co-presence exists, where each person is allowed to be fully themselves, unthreatened by the other's difference. The mature empath understands that true intimacy can only happen when one does not have to abandon themselves in order to stay close to someone else. And from that point, they begin to build bridges, not to carry the weight of others across, but to walk side by side toward a more honest territory. A place where no one has to perform, where no one has to disappear in order to be loved. If something in what you've just heard made you pause, even for a breath, if it allowed you to meet yourself with a little more softness, then perhaps this conversation between us is still ongoing. Not in words, but in resonance. If you feel you belong to this kind of journey, a journey of deep seeing, of quiet transformation, you are always welcome to walk with us a little farther. Subscribe to this channel if you'd like to stay connected to offerings like this. Not to follow, but to remember that you are not alone on the path of coming home to yourself. Thank you for listening. See you again in another quiet place.